Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So again, just a massive thank you to everyone who has subscribed so far, everyone who's following and watching, still waiting on some comments, but all in good time. Just really hoping that this all starts to start paying off very soon. Because I do put a lot of effort into these videos, not just obviously with outfits and makeup and whatnot. Um, just obviously the research that goes into them. So today's case, I'm kind of hoping it's one that maybe some of you never heard of. Maybe some of you maybe heard of it at the time because it was reported in the news. But it's sort of escaped your consciousness. So just a little disclaimer. Obviously, I'm putting a disclaimer at the beginning of the video, as I always do when there's like a sensitive subject that does come up. But this video is talking about the after effects of acid attacks. So the reason I researched this case, I come across it quite a few months ago. But obviously in the past couple of years or so, the rise of acid attacks has been reported quite a lot. And obviously there's been a couple of storylines on soap. So obviously a few years ago there was acid attack storyline on Emmerdale, and only this year we had acid attack storyline on Coronation Street. So the person I'm talking about today is a lady called Berlinah Wallace, and obviously, so like I said, this was about 9 years ago, I believe it was. So, yep, without further ado, we'll get into the story of Berlinah Wallace and her crime against her partner, Mark Van Dongen. So, who was Berlinah Wallace? So, Berlinah was born in 1969 in Saboken, South Africa. And at some point growing up or in her adult years, Berlinah contracted HIV. And she said this happened after being gang raped in South Africa, but obviously this couldn't be proven. This was never proven. No one was brought to justice for this. It could be just obviously Berlinah, unfortunately, is one of those people who make up these kind of stories to gain sympathy. I'm not saying that is 100% true, but it's going on from the more you hear about Berlinah, the more you would probably jump to that conclusion yourself. So in 1994, 25-year-old Berlinah, she relocates to the UK with her partner, Ray Wallace. He was a UK national. Um, they, before obviously separating, they had met, got married at some point, but they actually ended up separating in the mid 2000s. So, not really much has been described about Berlinah's early life growing up in South Africa. Um, all I can really find out about her is it was reported that she was never able to hold down a job. She studied fashion at university, but this was only on a part-time basis, and even then she was always more so absent than she was actually attending the classes. Um, so it's kind of difficult, like not knowing much about Berlinah's backstory. It's kind of difficult to know that if she was just slightly old-fashioned, she believed that a woman's place was at home and her husband was the one that had to be the breadwinner, or if she was just really, really lazy. Personally, I believe the latter. Like, I believe that she was just a really lazy person, a bit of a sponge. Especially going into the research I did, and I know there's a couple of other YouTubers who have done their own take on Berlinah's case, and I think they've probably just come to the same conclusion that I have. about this woman. The fact that she's just a lazy sponge, really. So after her breakup with Ray, Berlinah met a Mark Van Dongen on a dating site, and this site was specifically set up for people living with HIV. So Mark was born in 1987, so he was around 20 years younger than Berlinah. He come to live in the UK in 2010. He was a Dutch national. He wanted to study civil engineering at the University of Bristol, and he, as well, at some point during his life, had contracted HIV after a brief relationship in the city of Hague, in the Netherlands. Berlinah and Mark's relationship, this was described as abusive from day one. So obviously it started off quite verbal, but it escalated quickly into physical violence. On October the 10th, 2011. So Mark had to go and sort out medical treatment after Berlinah had poured a kettle of boiling water across his feet, or down his body, some part of his body. I believe it was his feet, but again, I couldn't find any specific details on what part of the body it was. Mark, obviously, being the trusting partner, or just not wanting to get Berlinah in trouble, he ended up telling everyone that he had actually poured it on himself by accident, and so Berlinah was never reprimanded for this attack. So they ended up moving into a property in Westbury Park in Bristol, and it was said that Berlinah would frequently fly into rages if she felt that Mark was trying to disobey her in any sort of way. So again, obviously jumping back just a minute ago when I was saying about Berlinah's belief systems, you kind of see with this story on what sides that we're all going to take on this when it comes to Berlinah's personality and her belief system. So Mark had found work as an engineer, and Berlinah was actually still apparently studying a fashion degree, but forever just calling in sick or just not attending her classes whatsoever. She would often take Mark's wages of £300 a day, and she used part of this to send money back to her family in South Africa, and then she would just spend the rest of the money on herself, to any little luxuries that she wanted to fund her lifestyle. Mark was essentially her little walking, talking ATM at this point. So Berlinah had took control of Mark's passport, and whenever he did try and leave her, she would emotionally manipulate him into staying. She would scratch herself, give herself black eyes, and then she would basically say that she was going to call the police and tell them that Mark was the one that was physically assaulting her, and she was going to get him locked up for this, or worst case scenario, have him deported out of the UK. She would go as far as threatening suicide if Mark left her, which then turned to her threatening to kill him, and then she would kill herself to obviously evade any sort of justice. On several occasions, Berlinah claimed that she was pregnant, and that each time she would suffer a miscarriage. This was her way of just obviously hiding the fact that she wasn't pregnant. There was no symptoms. A very manipulative but very easy thing for certain individuals of that disposition to actually do. On each of these occasions, Mark would always go back to Berlinah, so it was believed that Mark constantly was walking out on her because he just had enough. And each time Berlinah would know what button she needed to press to regain her control. And this cycle of emotional, physical, and financial abuse, this actually ended up going on for about 5 years. So co-workers of Mark said that he would often show them injuries that he had sustained in Berlinah's attacks. So obviously she thought she was being clever and obviously injuring him in places that not necessarily he would have on public display, so like probably his chest or the tops of his legs. But he was actually showing people these injuries. It was likely that these were made by a weapon. So Berlinah probably attacked him with a knife or something of that scripture. Possibly her nails. Who knows? Again, this is something that I can find a wonderful lot of information about. I can only really sum up from what I'm reading and from some of the stuff that I have seen in the media and other victims of domestic abuse, where it's a woman on a man. So during this time, Mark was in close contact with his father, Kees, and Kees still lived in Belgium. He described that Mark was in constant fear of Berlinah and her behaviour. In the summer of 2015, Mark finally plucked up the courage and left Berlinah. So at this point, Mark was 28 and successful in his work, where Berlinah was 48 or 49, and she had drained him in any which way that she could. And in July that year, Mark signed back onto online dating, and he met a lady called Violet Farquharson. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. It's quite a long name. I had to do a lot of digging to try and find, because a lot of places were just referring to her as her first name. But I believe this woman tried to help Mark in the best way that she could. Eventually, Berlinah got him back, and you do end up feeling sorry for Violet a little bit. So Violet, she was 46 and lived fairly close by, somewhere in Bristol. And Mark and Violet, they ended up going on 2 dates. So once to a coffee shop, and the second date was to the local cinema. Mark eventually came clean to Violet about his relationship with Berlinah. And first, Mark and Violet, they had communicated by email, and then obviously this turned into text messages. And unfortunately, Berlinah had hacked into Mark's phone and found all of these message exchanges between Mark and Violet. And finally, Mark walked away and told Violet that he was living in a hotel, but at the same time still paying the £1,000 a month rent on his property that he shared with Berlinah. And after a very short while in the hotel, Mark ended up moving in with Violet. So obviously, as I was pointing out, Violet really tried to help Mark in any way she could to try and get him out of this cycle. And Berlinah, at this point, she persistently contacted Mark to try and regain her control, and she even got hold of Violet's phone number. And she was harassing Violet with numerous silent calls. So obviously just probably ringing up on 141, and obviously when Violet was answering, Berlinah wasn't saying anything, or she probably just putting the phone down. That way you kind of get like people worried that someone's after him, and it's just all about mind control, especially with abusers like this. It's all about the mind control. So Berlinah, later in August 2015, she phoned Mark and saying that she had taken an overdose. This, however, was another lie that was conducted, well, made up by Berlinah. She tried to say that her ex-Ray had had a heart attack and that she needed someone to support her, and this all got a bit too much for her and ended up with her taking this apparent overdose. On August the 29th, during a meeting with a university counsellor, she stated that she was depressed, angry, betrayed, and very anxious. So she felt that she was being betrayed by Mark for not wanting to be with her anymore. So Berlinah's tactics seemed to start working, and a guilty Mark, like, I don't know what he would have to feel guilty about, but probably with Berlinah playing the mental health card and the victim is probably, and Mark obviously being the decent human being that he undoubtedly was, he's obviously felt really sorry for Berlinah and decided to go back to her. So Mark ended up telling Violet that they couldn't be together, and he began staying at the flat with Berlinah, but at some point he reported Berlinah to the police for harassing Violet. So Mark had continued to... Oh, sorry. Went a bit ahead of myself there. Ignore that. So obviously the police ended up speaking to Berlinah, but instead of obviously like pressing any charges, they just basically advised Berlinah to stay away from Violet and stop contacting her. From my understanding, with any sort of harassment, like some police do take it really seriously. It's just unfortunately in this case they didn't. If they did, I wouldn't probably be sitting here talking about this particular story today, and I really wish that was the case. So yeah, Mark, he continued paying the £1,000 rent on the flat, and he even was giving Berlinah an extra £750 a month. And this still wasn't enough for Berlinah, and she decided Mark needed to be punished for not wanting to be with her. So obviously, process there was that Mark had gone back to Berlinah, but she continued with her treatment of Violet, and again they broke up. He was still giving her money to live off, still paying the home so she had a roof over her head. But in Berlinah's world, in Berlinah's beliefs, this wasn't enough. Like, she needed someone to drain emotionally, physically, mentally, financially, like every which way that she could, and she couldn't do that unless Mark lived under the same roof as her. So in early September 2015, Berlinah went on to Amazon and she purchased a litre of 98% proof sulfuric acid. She also started doing internet searches around the causes of acid and the effects they can have on the human body, the effects that it can have if you were to ingest it in any which way. She looked up autopsy photos of people who had ingested acid, and she looked up the case of a man who had tried to get his girlfriend to drink acid by telling her that it was water. I tried to find that story myself and I wasn't really successful, so I can't really talk any more about that because I don't know what the outcome of that story was. So she looked at guidance on how to get an ex-pact, and she looking at what to say to reconcile, and she even looked up ways that she could use the acid as a defense if obviously that particular day was to come up in court or she was being arrested for it. She had what she thought was a really foolproof cover story as to why she had used acid as a weapon. So on September 22nd, 2015, Berlinah contacted Mark, and Berlinah was crying and saying that there was nothing for her in the UK. And at this point, she wanted to go back to South Africa, but she didn't have enough money for the flights. Mark turned up at the property later that evening, around 10 p.m, as he felt sorry for Berlinah, where she had threatened suicide. So Mark agreed to actually end up staying the night with her. In his head, he's probably thinking if she needs that support, she's not going to do anything while I'm here. Mark soon fell asleep wearing just his boxer shorts, and Berlinah ended up staying up and put the next phase of her plan into action. She poured the acid into a beaker that she had already had prepared, and at 2:06 a.m. she phoned an ex called Charles. And obviously these phone calls, it hasn't been said what was said during those phone calls, why she was ringing her ex-boyfriend at 2 o'clock in the morning. That discussion has never come up in any of the reports that I found. So can't really elaborate on what was actually said that night. 2:40 a.m. she finally wakes Mark up, and she shouts in his face, "If I can't have you, no one can." And she ended up throwing the contents of the beaker, so the acid, into Mark's face. But obviously with the splashing, it ended up going down to parts of his body. And the fact that Mark was lying down also contributed to that. So obviously it's probably dripped down onto his body. It ended up like 25% of his body was badly affected. So Mark at first, he thought it was water, but seconds later he said that he was in indescribable pain. His flesh began melting. In fact, if you Google the story, there are newspaper reports and photos of the crime scene. You will see the effects that the acid had on the bedding. It's really, really sad to look at, really horrible to look at. But those images are out there. Mark had managed to stagger onto the street, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs. And a neighbour, Dr. Nick White, she stated in court, "I was woken up by the sound of someone shouting for help. I looked out the window and saw a guy standing there in his boxers, and he looked a really, really strange colour. From his head to his shoulders, like a really odd sort of colour." Then my doorbell started ringing a few times, so I knew that there was something desperate going on. It was him, and he looked like he had been covered in clay mud, and I soon realised that this was just in fact his skin and his flesh melting. Dr. White then called 999, and Mark can actually be heard in the background of this 999 call in screaming out in agony. The fact that obviously he's been in an acid attack. The next day, the corrosive effect of the acid, it could be actually seen on the doorbell. Again, a photo that is out there. If you again look up the story, you should be able to find this picture. So obviously where Mark had run it, his flesh was actually melting off onto the metal of the doorbell. Another neighbour, they took Mark to another flat and they just started dousing him with cold water, as cold as you can get, which is actually a really good tip. This is what 909 operators, paramedics recommend if you are unfortunate enough to come across someone who has been in an acid attack. Their best advice is to douse the area with at least 60 litres of freezing cold, very clean water as much as you can, and that sort of stops most of the bad effects of acid. Not going to stop it completely, but it really does help. So, police and paramedics, they arrived really quickly, and Mark was taken to the ambulance, still screaming out in pain. You probably can't even imagine. And that he was screaming that he wasn't able to see. He started asking if he still had eyelids. So one officer at the scene looked and said that Mr. Van Dongen's eyes had turned a really horrible grey colour, and his irises had essentially dissolved because of the acid. Officers that went to the scene of the attack, they found Berlinah just calmly sitting on her sofa like nothing had happened. She just basically calmly told them Mark had been harmed with acid, and said that she had tried to douse him with a load of water, but her phone records, they just showed that after the attack she had again run her ex-partner, and no attempt to ring the emergency services was made by Berlinah. So Berlinah was arrested on the spot, and police took evidence and photos from the scene. So obviously what I just spoke about a minute ago. Again, obviously those photos are out there. If you have got a strong disposition, feel free to take a look. Obviously they were printed in news articles. So they were able to find at the scene the bottle of acid and the beaker. Police interviewed Berlinah, and she told them that Mark was basically the abusive partner in this situation, and that she was the victim. He had actually poured the acid and tried to get her to drink some with the pills, but that she, knowing that it was acid, or didn't realise it was acid, had thrown it into Mark's face in what she called was self-defence. She claimed, obviously, at first that she didn't know it was acid, and obviously she just assumed that it was water. So when obviously she realised that it was acid, she says that she tried to get Mark into the bathroom to douse him with water, but Mark had instead obviously run out onto the street to flag down any sort of neighbour that he could find or anyone that he could help. And Berlinah tried to say that she, at this whole entire time, was just completely confused as to what was going on. Luckily, the police didn't believe her cock and bull story, and she was actually charged with throwing a corrosive substance with intent to cause GBH, and she was remanded in custody to wait her day in court. So they usually either, obviously we all know, either bail or held in remand depending on the seriousness of the crime. Obviously they knew that she was a danger and immediately ship her off as quick as they could. So Mark was taken to Southmead Hospital in Bristol. Paramedics tried to relieve Mark's pain, but the acid and its corrosive effect had actually exposed Mark's nerve endings. You could just imagine cold air hitting exposed nerves. it's going to be a pain that you can't even think of in your wildest dreams. Like, absolutely awful. And when Mark had actually got to hospital, he actually caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. So obviously, I know earlier I was talking about a police officer that said that his eyes had turned grey. What it turns out that was Mark actually lost complete sight in his right eye, and he was partially sighted in his left eye. So obviously he managed to catch a glimpse of himself in the mirror, and upon seeing this, he just obviously started screaming again, and he begged the doctors to just kill him there and then. Like, just, I can't really blame the poor guy, if I'm honest. So yeah, he started screaming, "Kill me now! If my face looks like this, I don't want to live." So it took the doctors and the police quite a few weeks at this point to try and track down Mark's family. And Mark's father, Keith, was finally contacted. He drove from Belgium as quick as he could to be by his son's side. And when Keith arrived, he said that what he saw absolutely shocked him to the core. He said that when we entered this particular ward in the hospital, there were 6 rooms. And he ended up going from room to room to room, and basically just looked at the people that were laying in the beds and didn't recognise any of them. Sad thing was that Mark was actually laying in the first room that he entered, and Keith talked about feeling a little bit of guilt that he failed to recognise his own son. He went on to state that Mark's injuries were absolutely just unbelievable and devastating. I can't even imagine, but you know, looking at other survivors of acid attacks, I can sort of formulate a picture in my head, but it's just not one that I really want to think about or even think about being in that situation myself. Like, it's just most awful thing that I can ever imagine. So Mark was placed into a coma. So obviously, as I already stated, he had 25% of his body was burnt, and this skin, it had to be surgically removed. So again, obviously, he lost sight in one eye and he had partial sight in the other eye. His face just completely destroyed, and the flesh absolutely completely removed from his face. Mark was in a coma for the next 4 months, and at this point, for whatever reason, I don't know, I couldn't find a reason for this, but they sadly had to amputate Mark's left leg. So at this whole point, like, Keith stayed by his son's bedside for this whole entire time. When Mark finally was brought out of the coma, he could only actually move his mouth and move his tongue, and this is the only way that he was able to communicate with the doctors, communicate with his father. In fact, like, his dad would hold up a keyboard and he would point to a particular letter on the keyboard, and Mark could only stick his tongue out if that was the letter that he wanted. And this is the only way that Mark could obviously formulate a sentence. Mark eventually, he gained the power of his speech, but due to the injuries on his head, his face, his neck, this was incredibly painful for him. And doctors said that he was actually paralysed from the neck down, and he was going to be like this for the rest of his life. In November 2016, Mark was eventually able to leave the hospital, but he was told that he would have to live in supported accommodation for the rest of his life. Keith offered to help Mark move, but Mark wanted to gain some sort of independence back, and he somehow managed a way of sorting out the move himself. And Keith ended up returning back to Belgium at this point. Once he knew Mark had settled in and had got to this place safely, he ended up returning back to his home in Belgium. However, the very next day, Mark had called Keith, like, screaming at the top of his lungs down the phone, begging his father to come and help him. And Keith, yet again, jumped right into his car, drove all the way over, and ended up coming to the care home about early hours of the morning, he stated. Didn't give an exact time, just said it was early hours of the morning, had to drive all the way from Belgium to Gloucester. So he actually found Mark, like, Mark was just in a terrible state, actually covered in his own feces. He said that as he was walking up to the front door, all he could hear was his really high-pitched screaming, and obviously entered the room to find his son just laying in his own bed, covered in feces. Keith got Mark out of bed, cleaned him up, and at this point, Mark just begged his father to take him back to Belgium. So Keith organised a private ambulance to come and sort out the travel arrangements of getting Mark over to Belgium to his house so he could actually take proper good care of him. And Keith offered Mark a room in the house, and Mark just basically turned this down. He was just said, "Dad, like, it's just going to be another ceiling that I've got to stare at." Due to the nerve damage, Mark would have bouts of extreme pain, but then there are other times that he was riddled with an irritating feeling in his skin. So sort of like one of those itches where you get where you can't reach it, it's really, really aggravates you. Imagine that, having that all over your body and you're not able to do anything about it because you can't move your body from the neck down. He would obviously get his father to scratch these, and it just basically did nothing. There was no way that he could get rid of this irritating feeling. In late 2016, Mark developed a chest infection, and due to the damage of his lungs, they were filling up with fluid, and the doctors basically told him they had to enter a tube into his throat, and this was the only way they'll be able to drain his lungs of the fluid. This essentially meant that Mark would again lose the power of his speech, and they said that it could be a permanent thing. And Mark decided there and then that he just didn't want to live like this anymore. He had gone from basically a 6'5", fit and healthy young man, a really successful engineer, to someone with basically just no hope of any sort of recovery. Like, that's how damaged his poor body was. Like you can't even imagine. Like, you look at someone like Katie Piper, and she has done phenomenal with her recovery, and you read stories like this, and it just really, really puts it into place how corrosive and dangerous this stuff actually is. So he knew that his condition was just going to get worse. He knew his situation was just going to be a lot more horrific. Mark actually applied to a euthanasia clinic in Belgium, and Keith basically tried to talk his son out of this, begged him, but Mark was just adamant, and he just replied, "Dad, I've suffered so much pain and I'm tired of fighting, I'm done fighting." And basically just begged his dad, "Please, Dad, just let me go." So Mark was assessed by 3 consultant psychiatrists, and they confirmed that in their terms, Mark's case was one of unbearable physical and psychological suffering. To them, Mark was of a sound mind, and he was able to make an informed decision as to when his life should come to an end. So Keith spent the final few weeks with Mark saying that he was brave, and he was just basically resolute, he was a fighter. Mark ended up choosing the 2nd of January 2017 as the day that he wanted to die. When asked if he wanted Keith there, Mark said, "I want my dad to accompany me on my last journey." At 7:15 p.m, doctors checked in on Mark, and they wanted to make sure that all the laws had been followed at this point. And a doctor actually came and inserted a catheter into Mark's heart. Mark ended up passing away at the age of 29. So after 15 months of absolute torture, absolute pain, he was finally out of it. So due to Mark's death, Berlinah was eventually charged with murder as well as throwing a corrosive substance to cause grievous bodily harm. She pled not guilty to both of these charges. Her trial began at Bristol Crown Court in May 2018, and Keith went and attended every single day of her trial. Berlinah basically stuck to the story that she told the police, that Mark had been trying to kill her, and that he had tried to get her to drink the acid. She had thrown the acid on him, believing that it was water. Berlinah cried, she sat there and had the audacity to cry in the dock, trying to blame the victim, believing that that she was able to manipulate everyone gladly, and everyone just basically saw through her. When asked why Mark wanted to kill her, she said that she found out that Mark was working as a male prostitute, and this was over in Holland, and he was actually really scared that she was going to reveal this. I mean, there's a lot worse things in the world than being on the game. I honestly, why she would think that finding out someone's a prostitute means that you're going to have to throw acid in someone's face. It's absolutely beyond me. It's absolutely... I have no words, honestly, for this woman. So Berlinah said that she felt sad about Mark's injuries, but she couldn't explain why she hadn't called an ambulance and why she hadn't done it right away when it was brought up about why she hadn't done that right away. So when it was brought up about the purchase of the acid and the surgeon of the injuries, so Berlinah said that she only purchased it as a way of treating fabric. and she had looked up the cause of injuries that acid can make on the human skin, as she was actually scared of Mark's threats. So apparently, she's saying that Mark had been threatening this for quite some time. One thing, and they probably did bring it up in court, but one thing I am going to say, if someone was threatening you in your home about potentially using acid on you, why would you go out and actually buy that weapon of choice and keep it in your home? You know, it's. I mean, obviously, yeah, like, they saw through this instantly. Like, this woman is so see through, she probably bathes in fucking Windex. But thankfully, like, the court cannot be manipulated as much as she probably thought that they could be. Despite Berlinah's story, it was shown that Mark's fingerprints were not on the bottle of acid at all, nowhere near the beaker, not even on the rim of the beaker. And Berlinah was convicted on the 17th of May 2018, but this was actually only for throwing the acid. So she got found not guilty of the murder charge. So this was actually down to Mark choosing to end his life, and they put that down as that his death was not a direct a direct result of Berlinah's assault. On the 23rd of May 2018, Berlinah stood before Mrs. Justice Nicola Davis and Bristol Crown Court. Justice Davis said that Berlinah was sadistic and added, "You chose your moment to attack, and this occurred when Mark Van Dongen was only wearing boxer shorts. He was asleep in the bed which you shared in your flat. He was vulnerable and almost naked. He awoke, but he had no real opportunity to avoid the focus of your attack, and you aimed at his face and his body immediately before the attack. You said to Mark, 'If I can't have you, then no one can.' Your intention was to burn and disfigure and disable Mark Van Dongen so that he wouldn't be attracted to any other woman. To me, this was an act of pure evil." She identified Berlinah as a manipulative and controlling woman who, before handing down her sentence, Berlinah was sentenced to a life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years. And basically, that means that once she's released after the 12 years, she has a life license. So obviously, I spoke briefly about those before in other videos. It just basically means that Berlinah has to set and stand by a certain list of rules for the rest of her life. And even just down to nicking a chocolate bar, could see her going back to prison upon the day they are actually stupid enough to release this woman. And this is just down to whether the parole board or not believe that Berlinah is no longer a danger to the society. So Justice Davis took into account Berlinah's time on remand, and so this actually means that she could be released by 2027, but depending on her behaviour in prison, which I can't find anything on, but it could be as early as 2024, so only a couple of months' time. So if she's released in 2027, Berlinah will probably be about 58, 59. Obviously, next year she'll be, I think it's like 54, I believe. 54, 55, I'm not too sure. So Keith was outraged at the sentencing, and he stated that he believed that Berlinah should have been locked up for the remainder of her life. In his victim impact statement, Keith said that he feels like a absolutely broken man. He's completely drained, and that the old Keith just no longer exists. He's lost our battle. Oh, Mark and I, sorry, have lost our battle. In the past, nothing would absolutely faze me, but now I have lead in my shoes. So, after Mark's death, there was a change in the law, and this was due to the spike in increases of acid being used as a weapon. So it's actually become really popular with certain gangs. So obviously due to the crackdown of guns and knives, acid started becoming the weapon of choice for certain gang members. So obviously because of the this increase, and then the attack on Mark, there was an actual law that was imposed. So it basically means that you cannot buy anything above 15% nowadays. Obviously the really strong stuff is still out there. I don't know how you come across it. I don't want to know. I'm not interested, but I assume obviously it's probably on the black market somewhere. Because obviously, again, another thing that I pointed out in other videos, that what we see on Google is actually only a really small percentage of the internet. The rest, I think it's like 95% of the internet is the deep dark web, where you can literally buy anything. But it really depends on the disposition of the person that you are. Thankfully, with this law in place, not many people are going to be able to buy acid. So, really hoping in the future we're going to start seeing less and less of these sort of types of attacks. So, yeah, again, I just want to thank you all so much for listening. A little bit emotional. Sorry, it's just awful. Should never have happened. This should have been a law from day one. If it was a law, like Mark potentially would still be here. And all I can say is that obviously, thankfully, Berlinah has been in prison for quite a number of years now. I'm just really hoping that the judge or the parole board, they're not stupid enough to think that she's safe enough to go out in public. And just I'm shocked that she hasn't spent the rest of her life in prison. But unfortunately, the law in this country states that if obviously something like this happens to someone and they take their own life, it's not seen as murder because the acid wasn't a direct cause of their death. So, yeah, massive thank you to everyone, and I will see you very soon in the next video. Stay safe and have a good evening.